There are forms of collapse that do not resemble tragedy. They are not loud, not dramatic, not marked by visible fractures for outsiders to recognize. They unfold instead as a quiet depletion of the soul. In the depths of spiritual and philosophical thought, it is understood that every human being lives within an invisible covenant with themselves, either to face the truth and mature, or to flee it and continue existing within illusion. The narcissist chooses flight very early on, not because they are inherently evil, but because they lack the inner safety required to remain present with their own truth. They construct themselves as a living defensive architecture, where the persona becomes a refuge, where image outweighs essence, where admiration replaces connection, and where control is used to seal over a primordial shame that has never been healed. Within this structure, the soul is never truly heard. Authentic emotion is pushed into darkness, and the true self is never given the chance to fully form. Carl Jung called this rejected part the shadow. Ancient spiritual traditions named it the exiled soul. Existential philosophy described it as life unlived. Whatever the name, the law remains unchanged. What is denied does not disappear, it merely accumulates energy in silence. The narcissist lives their entire life through reflection. They borrow the gaze of others to feel real, borrow fear to feel powerful, borrow love to avoid confronting the inner void. But within the subtle order of the universe, no borrowing is permanent. When the mirrors begin to tire, when others can no longer carry their sense of worth, when the stories they tell about themselves start to contradict and fracture, the false structure slowly loses the energy that sustains it. This collapse does not arrive as punishment, nor as moral retribution, but as the natural consequence of a life built on denial. This is not a romantic awakening where humility suddenly blooms and change follows. It is the moment when the soul is forced to face itself because there is nowhere left to hide. For the narcissist, it is the moment when the persona can no longer contain the shadow, when silence speaks louder than every justification, when they realize that no one can carry their inner burden for them anymore. And in that moment, what matters most is no longer how they collapse, but what you come to understand more deeply. No one can live the truth that another refuses to face. And true freedom begins only when you stop serving as a mirror for souls unwilling to look directly into their own darkness. Chapter 1. What the narcissist is really running from. When people talk about narcissists, many assume they are running from their past, from trauma, or from responsibility toward others. But at a deeper level, what they flee from their entire lives is not a specific memory or a failed relationship. It is the experience of being alone with themselves without reflection. For a psychologically healthy structure, solitude is a space for listening inward, for experiencing oneself as a whole being. But for the narcissist, being alone means there is no one left to hold their sense of existence for them. Carl Jung pointed out that when a person cannot tolerate the presence of the true self, they will construct a persona as a survival structure. And in the narcissist, the persona is not merely a social mask, but the entire house they live inside. Within that house, everything is arranged to avoid one central feeling, the primal shame of, I am not enough, I am empty, I have no value unless I am seen. Instead of facing and integrating this feeling, they learn to deny it through power, through control, through appropriating the emotions of others as proof of their own existence. This is why narcissists do not love in the deep sense of the word, because love requires genuine presence, while they can only exist through reflection. They do not seek people, they seek mirrors. They do not seek connection, but validation. They do not seek truth, but a story strong enough to cover the inner void. Jung called this denied truth the shadow. But what must be understood is that the narcissist's shadow does not contain only negative traits. It also contains their vulnerable self, the part that needs love, the part that was never allowed to exist. Unable to endure the pain of seeing this part, they choose flight by living in constant motion, changing partners, changing roles, changing narratives, changing stages. Each time the persona is rebuilt, it feels like survival, but in reality, it is only a postponement of an unavoidable confrontation. And it is this prolonged escape that becomes the true seed of collapse. Because in the deep spiritual and psychological order, what is denied does not disappear. It only accumulates energy in silence, waiting for the moment when the defensive structure can no longer sustain itself. This truth is not meant to condemn the narcissist, but to face a colder reality. Their collapse does not begin when they lose you. It begins at the very first moment they learn to turn away from themselves, after which their entire life becomes a journey of running with no destination. Chapter 2: Denial creates the loop, when escape becomes psychological destiny. The key reason narcissists never truly escape their old lives does not lie in a lack of opportunity, love, or favorable circumstances, but in a far deeper mechanism. The refusal to face their inner core turns their entire existence into a closed loop. Carl Jung famously emphasized that what is not brought into consciousness does not disappear, but returns as fate. And for the narcissist, that fate is not a dramatic external event, but the near-perfect repetition of the same psychological script across relationships and life stages. They may change partners, change jobs, change environments, even change the story they tell about themselves, but the inner structure remains unchanged because it has never been truly seen. This denial is not a conscious act of, "I don't want to think about it," but an early formed survival mechanism where a fragile self learns that touching primal shame, emptiness, or feelings of insufficiency would be too painful to endure, and thus the only way to survive is to cover it with a sufficiently strong persona. From that moment on, life is no longer oriented toward inner growth, but toward maintaining the defensive structure. In practical terms, this explains why narcissistic relationships follow an almost mechanical sequence. Rapid idealization to generate vitality and power, control to keep the image from being threatened, devaluation when the other no longer reflects perfectly, and finally, abandonment or disappearance to avoid facing the unchanged inner void. What is striking is that in their own perception, each loop is disguised as a new beginning. They genuinely believe that this time will be different, that this person will be different, that this situation will save them from the familiar emptiness. But because the problem was never other people or circumstances, but the refusal to look inward, the new beginning becomes only a more refined copy of the old loop. Modern psychological research strongly supports this view. In a highly influential clinical framework, Heinz Kohut, the founder of self-psychology, showed that individuals with pathological narcissistic structures are deeply dependent on what he called self-objects, others who are used to regulate emotions and sustain a sense of self. When a self-object fails to function, the narcissistic individual does not turn inward to self-regulate as a psychologically mature person would, but instead seeks a replacement self-object, leading to a pattern of jumping from relationship to relationship without true integration or learning. A study published in the Journal of Personality Disorders in 2014 further found that individuals with high narcissistic traits not only tend to repeat the same types of conflict in intimate relationships, but also show a reduced capacity to extract emotional lessons from negative experiences, because they rely on defenses such as denial and projection to protect their self-image. This means that experience, rather than becoming a source of growth, is restructured to serve avoidance. At an even deeper level, this repetition carries an almost spiritual meaning. A soul that is not heard will seek to be seen through circumstances. Each time the narcissist believes they have escaped, started over, or moved on, the unconscious arranges for them to fall into the same type of relationship, the same conflicts, the same emotional outcomes, because that is the only way truth can knock on consciousness. But instead of opening the door, they build another layer of persona, tightening the loop further. Over time, the energy required to maintain this escape increases significantly, while external sources of reflection become less stable, especially as age, responsibility, and reality erode initial charm. It is here that collapse begins to be silently programmed, not through a single shock, but through the gradual exhaustion of the capacity to keep repeating the loop. What matters for those who were once attached to a narcissist is understanding that you were not an exception within this pattern, nor the cause of their failure to change. You were simply one point in a chain of reflections used to avoid self-confrontation. Seen in this light, your departure did not destroy them, it merely removed one piece of the escape structure, bringing the loop closer to its inevitable point of collapse. And this is the profound paradox of denial. The more one tries to run, the more one is forced to repeat, until there is no longer enough strength left to run at all, because no one can circle endlessly without eventually facing the center. Chapter 3. Narcissistic collapse is not an awakening, but the moment the ego has nowhere left to hide. If there is one of the most dangerous misunderstandings surrounding narcissistic collapse, it is the belief that collapse equals awakening, remorse, or the beginning of genuine change. On the surface, collapse may look like a moment of realization. They appear sadder, more panicked, speak in seemingly humble tones, even admit to feeling empty. But at deeper psychological and spiritual levels, narcissistic collapse is not light entering consciousness. It is the moment when the structure of escape no longer has enough energy to keep functioning. Carl Jung made a clear distinction between crises that carry transformative potential and crises that lead to fragmentation. Only an ego strong enough can endure the truth of the shadow and integrate it. When the ego is already fragile, truth does not bring healing, it brings disintegration. For the narcissist, collapse occurs when the persona is no longer sustained by external reflection, when the stories they tell about themselves are no longer believed, when emotional supply is depleted or unstable. What collapses is not their true self, because that self was never fully formed, but the false structure that once allowed them to feel that they existed. This is why collapse is often accompanied by extreme reactions rather than quiet reflection. Panic, rage, smear campaigns, desperate bids for attention, or complete disappearance. From a clinical psychology perspective, this is explained by a lack of internal emotional regulation. Otto Kernberg's research on narcissistic personality pathology shows that when higher-level defenses fail, individuals rapidly regress to primitive defenses such as splitting, denial, and projection, dividing the inner world into absolute good and absolute bad, with no gray zone for reflection or tolerance. As a result, collapse does not lead them to examine their behavior toward others, but drives them to focus all their energy on escaping the rising shame and emptiness. On a spiritual level, this is the moment when the soul knocks the loudest, yet it is also when the door is most tightly shut, because opening it would require consciously enduring suffering, something the narcissistic structure has never learned to tolerate. Instead of descending inward to integrate, they attempt a lateral escape into another reality, a new relationship, a new role, a new narrative, hoping to quickly restore a sense of false wholeness. This explains why many are shocked to see narcissists recover so quickly after what appeared to be a severe collapse. In truth, this is not recovery, but emergency reconstruction of the persona. And with each such reconstruction, the cost grows higher. The capacity to feel, connect, and live authentically shrinks, while the inner void becomes increasingly apparent. Collapse, therefore, is not an ending, but a sign that the escape loop has entered a more dangerous phase, one in which repetition no longer brings a sense of vitality, but only exhaustion. Understanding this frees you from the illusion that if you stay long enough, love hard enough, or wait patiently enough, their collapse will turn into awakening. The cold truth is this: awakening occurs only when a person is willing to remain with the pain of truth without immediately trying to escape it. And that very capacity is what the narcissistic structure has never allowed to form. Chapter 4: Karma does not come to punish, it comes to complete the psychological structure. When people speak of karma in the story of the narcissist, many unconsciously expect a visible form of retribution: loss, abandonment, loneliness, paying a price equal to the harm caused. But at deeper psychological and spiritual levels, karma does not operate as an external hand of punishment. It functions as an inner principle of completion. Carl Jung did not use the term karma in a religious sense, yet his entire body of work revolves around an equivalent truth. Life compels individuals to relive what they refuse to bring into consciousness until the structure of escape reveals its own limits. For the narcissist, karma is not being treated badly, but being permanently trapped in a mode of existence without depth, where relationships are shallow, achievements are hollow, and moments that appear victorious must be constantly reaffirmed because there is no inner foundation to support them. This is a cold form of karma, undramatic, but persistent and irreversible without genuine confrontation. On a practical level, the narcissist's karma manifests through a remarkably consistent rule. They can attract, but they cannot keep. They can impress, but they cannot bond. They can be admired, but they are rarely deeply trusted. Each new relationship initially brings a sense of vitality, but quickly becomes a burden when the other begins to ask for what they cannot give: real presence. When that happens, the familiar script activates, not because the other person is not good enough, but because the internal structure does not allow intimacy to endure. Jung described this as the cost of living through persona. Persona helps one adapt to the world, but when it becomes the sole dwelling place, the soul is starved. Karma, in this sense, is precisely that prolonged starvation. The more one tries to compensate externally, the emptier the inside becomes. What makes the narcissist's karma especially severe is not its intensity, but its inescapable repetition. They do not learn from loss, because every loss is reinterpreted to protect self-image. They do not grow through crisis, because every crisis is avoided by changing contexts. They do not gain the wisdom of age, because time erodes the energy of the persona without strengthening the self. Here, karma does not need to do anything at all. It simply allows the structure to keep operating, and that operation leads to its own outcome. As age advances, charm fades, and reconstructing narratives requires ever more energy. Karma reveals itself as existential loneliness. No one truly knows who they are, and they themselves are no longer certain who they are beyond worn-out roles. At a deeper spiritual level, the narcissist's karma is the inability to return home to themselves. While those who dare to face their shadow can gradually integrate, accept, and live more fully over time, the narcissist remains trapped in an extended present, constantly proving worth, constantly needing to be seen, constantly avoiding silence. Silence, for them, is not peace, but an abyss, because in silence there is nothing left to reflect the persona. Karma, therefore, is not loud, does not require witnesses, yet is as relentless as gravity. It pulls them ever closer to what they have always fled, the inner emptiness itself. And what matters for you, who were once drawn into that orbit, is realizing that their karma does not need your presence, nor your waiting. The moment you withdraw from the role of reflection, karma begins completing its work, not to enact revenge, but to return each soul to the very point they spent a lifetime avoiding. Chapter 5. When the new life collapses, why they disappear instead of facing it. There is a very particular moment in the narcissist's journey and it is also the moment most easily misunderstood by those who were hurt the most, when the new life they rush to construct after the rupture begins to crack. From the outside, this phase can look like a sudden stumble. The new relationship cools off, the perfect image stops convincing. The story they tell about happiness and success no longer gets the same applause. But at deeper psychological and spiritual levels, this is not the failure of a plan. It is the exposure of a structure that never had a foundation. The narcissist's new life was never truly new. It was simply another stage built from the same old script, with the hope that this time the persona would stand a little longer under the weight of truth. When that stage begins to shake, the first thing the narcissist feels is not sadness or remorse, but a violent surge of primal shame. Unlike guilt, which requires the capacity to take responsibility, primal shame is the sense that one's entire self is wrong, empty, unacceptable. Clinical work on narcissistic personality pathology shows that this is the feeling that most powerfully triggers escape responses. When self-image is threatened, the narcissistic individual prioritizes preserving the persona at any cost, even if that means erasing traces, cutting contact, or disappearing entirely from the current context. That is why, when the new life collapses, they rarely stay to face, repair, or take responsibility. They disappear not because they don't care, but because staying would mean seeing themselves through eyes that no longer idealize them. From a Jungian perspective, this disappearance is a final defensive act of the persona. When they can no longer sustain the old narrative and are still not strong enough to form a true self, the only way to avoid psychological disintegration is to exit the stage. This explains why many narcissists choose ghosting, change their living environment, switch social circles, or even completely redefine their identity after a period of collapse. They are not running toward the future. They are running away from the present moment, where the shadow is moving closer to consciousness than ever before. And each time they run, they feel temporary relief, as if they've escaped danger. But in reality, they are simply carrying the entire unfaced structure into a new loop. The crucial point is this: the new life collapses, not because the new person is inferior to you, and not because you were uniquely special in some magical sense, but because no human being can remain a stable mirror forever for a structure built on avoidance. Every reflection has limits, every stage eventually wears down, and every persona consumes energy over time. As that energy drains, truth begins to leak through small cracks. Inconsistency in speech, emotional depletion, coldness or irritability with no clear cause, and an emptiness that becomes harder and harder to conceal. At that point, the new life can no longer perform its psychological firefighting function, and disappearance becomes the last survival strategy. For you, the one who witnessed or endured that disappearance, what you need to understand is this: their leaving is not proof that they won, and it is not a sign that you have been abandoned yet again. It is a clear demonstration of the limits of a life that refuses to face itself. They disappear because they do not have the inner structure to remain with truth, and in the deep order of psychology, disappearing never resolves anything. It only postpones the unavoidable meeting with the self. When you see it from this vantage point, you realize their new life will not collapse only once. It will collapse again and again, until they either choose confrontation or completely exhaust their ability to keep running. And the moment you are no longer pulled into these disappearances, no longer trying to understand them or rescue the situation, is the moment you step out of a karmic loop that was never yours to carry. Chapter 6. Why They Don't Change. The final limit of the narcissistic structure. After everything cycles, collapse, karma, disappearance, the most haunting question keeps returning for so many people. Why don't they change? Why, even after hitting bottom, losing people, and breaking, does the narcissist still not move into a deeper, truer way of living, but instead continues reenacting the same structure in a different costume? The answer, as difficult as it is to accept, becomes consistent when viewed through depth psychology and spiritual insight. Real change requires something the narcissistic structure does not allow to form: the capacity to stay with conscious suffering. Carl Jung called the path to maturity individuation, a process in which a person must dare to look directly at the shadow, accept inner contradiction, and endure shame, disorientation, and the collapse of old self-images. This is not random pain, it is meaningful pain, the kind that leads to integration and expanded consciousness. But the narcissist's entire psychological architecture is built precisely to avoid this kind of pain. Very early on, the narcissist learns that fully feeling authentic emotion is unsafe. Instead of developing an ego strong enough to tolerate disappointment, contradiction, and injury, they develop a persona strong enough to never have to touch those feelings at all. Heinz Kohut emphasized that in pathological narcissism, the development of the self is severely disrupted. They do not learn self-regulation, but must rely on others to perform that function for them. In adulthood, this dependency does not vanish. It only changes form. They need admiration to feel real, need control to feel safe, and need avoidance to prevent collapse. In that context, change is not experienced as an opportunity for evolution, but as a life-threatening danger. Facing truth would mean the persona must die, and for the narcissist, the persona is not just a mask. It is the only flotation device keeping them above water. At an even deeper level, their inability to change is not rooted in ignorance of right and wrong, but in a lack of inner capacity to contain truth. Otto Kernberg, in his work on personality pathology, explains that when the ego is not integrated, direct contact with self-truth can trigger disintegration rather than healing. This clarifies why, whenever narcissists are forced to face reality through failure, loss, or honest feedback, the common response is not reflection, but rage, denial, smearing, or retreat. They do not choose not to change in a moral sense. They are constrained by the very structure that once helped them survive. Yet what helped them survive becomes exactly what prevents them from truly living. Spiritually, this is the deepest paradox of narcissistic existence. They avoid suffering to avoid breaking, but that very avoidance ensures they are never reborn. In many mystical traditions, transformation passes through a death of the old self, a period in which a person temporarily loses direction, loses identity, and must remain in darkness long enough for new light to form. For the narcissist, this stage is almost impossible, because they lack the inner trust that they can exist without a role. So instead of descending to integrate, they move sideways, switching relationships, environments, narratives, images, hoping motion can replace transformation. But motion never creates depth, and time only reveals the limits of that strategy. This leads to a truth many people need in order to free themselves. The narcissist's lack of change is not a failure of your love, and it is not because you were not patient enough or sacrificial enough. It is the inevitable consequence of a structure that cannot enter individuation without a collapse endured consciously, and that is the very thing they fear most. When you understand that true change requires the ability to remain with suffering without immediately seeking an exit, you see why so many narcissists can keep living, succeed, and start over, yet rarely truly mature. And the moment you stop waiting for that change, stop placing hope in something their structure cannot provide, is the moment you begin your own path of confrontation, the only path that leads to real inner freedom. Chapter 7. What this means for you. When you stop carrying someone else's shadow. After understanding the narcissist's cycles, collapse, and karma, the most important question is no longer where they will end up, but where you choose to stand in this story. For a long time, it is very likely that you unconsciously carried a role that was never yours to bear. The role of the mirror, the emotional stabilizer, the refuge for parts of themselves they did not dare to face. You may have believed that if you were patient enough, understanding enough, loving enough, one day they would finally confront themselves, change, and mature. But the deeper truth this journey forces you to face is this: no one can live the truth that another refuses to carry. When you remain too long in the role of reflection, you do not only delay their collapse, you delay your own growth. Carl Jung emphasized that individuation is not merely an inner journey, but also a process of separating from unconscious bonds that compel us to live out another person's psychological life. For many empaths and sensitive individuals, attachment to a narcissist often comes with a subtle illusion. If I leave, they will collapse. In reality, what brings collapse is not your departure, but the absence of someone willing to keep carrying their unintegrated shadow. And conversely, what exhausts you is not that they were more cruel than you imagined, but that you tried to do a job no soul can ever do for another. This chapter is not an invitation to take pleasure in their karma, nor to wait for the day they get what they deserve. The truth is that their karma does not require an audience nor your witness to unfold. The moment you understand that their collapse is not an invitation for you to return and rescue them, but a sign that your role as a mirror has reached its end, you begin to step out of the old orbit. When you stop reacting, stop explaining, stop hoping they will see what you saw long ago, you are not harming them, you are simply returning to them the responsibility of facing themselves. At the same time, you return to yourself the right to live a life no longer drained by cycles that were never yours. At a deeper spiritual level, this is the moment you withdraw your soul from an unconscious contract. The contract to remain inside someone else's darkness in order to feel meaningful. When that contract is broken, what emerges is not emptiness, but a new inner space, one in which you can finally hear your own voice without it being drowned out by another person's needs, hunger, or fear. This also explains why so many people only truly begin to heal after they stop monitoring, analyzing, and questioning the narcissist's life. Not because you have become indifferent, but because your psychological energy is no longer being pulled back into an old structure. When you are no longer the mirror, their image gradually loses its centrality, and at the same time, your own image returns to its rightful place, a person entering their own path of confrontation. Here, karma reverses direction, not their karma, but yours, in the Jungian sense, completing itself as you stop repeating old roles, stop being defined by old relationships, and stop living inside a story you never wrote for yourself. And in that moment, a profound and liberating truth becomes clear. You do not need to win, be chosen, or be validated by someone who refuses to face themselves. Your freedom does not come from their collapse. It comes from stepping out of the shadow of their escape. When you dare to remain with your own truth, however painful or empty it may feel, at first you have done what the narcissist could not. And that is the point at which your paths permanently diverge, moving in two entirely different directions.